If there be light, then there is darkness. If cold, heat. If height, depth. If solid, fluid. If hard, soft. If rough, smooth. If calm, tempest. If prosperity, adversity. If life, death. Pythagoras. Hello, folks, and welcome back to the Heart of Witchcraft podcast. I am your host, Sassafras, and it's been a little bit of time since we last spoke. Aside from saying that I hope that you are well, I'm just going to skip the pleasantries and jump right into some content for us to consider. It has been a bit. The subject for today is one which seems to have captured the fascination of the occult/witch communities, and that is shadow work. So let's start by discussing just what shadow work is. Well, so often in life we find ourselves in conflict with others, with institutions, and with cold reality, dealing with an abusive relationship, with poverty and its effects, with outright warfare and a fight to survive on the battlefield. These are clear examples of things with which one can struggle, with an observer being able to very clearly see the different sides and what's going on, and in terms of a story, it is a very straightforward delivery. What does victory look like in these examples? Perhaps one finally takes a step, stands up for themselves, and triumphs over an abusive parent or lover and establishes boundaries, escapes and finds freedom outside of the particular relationship and its troubles. Perhaps through effort, luck, and just the courage to take a chance, one finds a rock of economic stability enough to survive the crashing waves of financial turbulence and the strain which it confers. Perhaps through banding together with others, the collective lights are torch enough to banish the darkness of such monetary uncertainty. Perhaps the battle is terrible and vicious and scarring, but ultimately is won, and through grit and adrenaline, one is left standing at the end over one's foes. I simplify here because, much like movie plots, I know that things are quite more complicated than what's being presented here, but that's the point. It's often presented like it's a movie. But such struggles are meant to be overcome, sure. We struggle every day with external and outside forces which interject into our lives. But what about when those cameras aren't rolling? What about when the protagonist that just saved Amity from a giant shark wakes up afterward in a cold sweat with heart pounding in his chest and wonders if perhaps part of themselves was lost out on that ocean that day? What do you do with that? All too often we find ourselves looking at a story, sometimes the story we tell ourselves, and it's so simple, it's just a struggle in an unfair world. And perhaps that's a good enough story for Hollywood, but that isn't where we live. Things get murky and things get ugly. William Faulkner once said that the human heart in conflict with itself is the only thing worth writing about. And while this seems simple enough, it is a line which speaks volumes. So what is shadow work? The term itself comes from the founder of analytical psychology, Carl Jung, who was born in 1875 and 1961, whose life itself is well worth study. If only so that you can see what an influence it has had, his thoughts, indeed his spirituality, on modern Wicca and witchcraft. Jung, in many ways, thought of the human mind as, well, kind of like a computer desktop, with many, many icons representing different facets of a human. These are the so-called archetypes. Whole discussions could be had on the subject. I want to try and stay on track as best as can. So let's talk about the id, the ego, and the superego. This is within his classification, and we're going to run with that here. So if you have issues with this particular aspect of psychology, kindly be quiet, I'll go on. I'm joking. The id, in this case, is your instinct, it's your drives, it's your impulses. It's that caveman within, the reptilian brain, and it is most concerned with survival and gratification, and what those two things entail. The id is unconcerned with complex thought, with the repercussions of its actions, with logic, etc. These complexities are handed off to another part of this engine. That part being the ego. The ego recognizes the needs of the id, and it mediates between the lusts and desires of base survival and the reality in play around it. Here's where pleasures may be foregone in favor of better results later. A fisherman may well eat a bait fish to survive, but you'll enjoy a better payoff if instead you cut up that bait fish and use it to attract an even larger fish. It's the part that's willing to forego instant gratification in favor of something better later on, or in favor of something not as bad later on. You don't yank a cell phone out of someone else's hands just because you want a fancy cell phone. Instead, you ask them what model it is and see if you can afford it, or possibly make a plan and wait for a deal in which you would finance it. That world of internal recognition of finance plans and the prohibitions of stealing, indeed the passwords, knowledge of the passwords that would be on such a device, which would not let you pick it up and just use it, well, these things kind of get shuffled off to the superego. The superego, now keep in mind, all of these are translations from the German, which was, Jung was a student of Freud's, and so his terminology is somewhat used in the same fashion, but these terms were never used by the authors of them. The superego, it stands on the shoulder of the ego, and it makes it kind of like a little, the little angel or the devil, offering advice on how best to be an example of an ideal. It is the guidance of society. It strives for perfection. It presses one to strive hard to meet ideals and goals. That's the superego. And so, kind of an advice for the ego in its own way, but it's within its own kind of structure, its own kind of goals. In a way, it's kind of like, it's kind of the part that recognizes to the ego that, yes, you might want to go about things this way, but the way that it's going to work out is, sometimes you got to cheat to get ahead a little bit. Is it good? Is it bad? This is a kind of thing that's wrestled between the superego and the ego. And so we see these three operating in a balance, or an unbalance as it turns out, with the ego moderating between the perhaps unrealistic or unworkable ideals of the superego, and the base drives and lusts of the id are being wrestled with against that. But the ego has its own passions to consider as well. This reminds me a little bit of, it's not too dissimilar, and you see different breakdowns of things, but Aristotle's conception of the soul was consumed of three different, bits, as it were. There's the body, there's the mind, and then there's kind of, I guess it's kind of the soul part. And so you have in this analogy, the body is kind of like the horses of a chariot, and they are being wrestled with by the higher parts. They want to run in this direction, but things are only going to work out if you direct them better. And so there's a moderation of things. The passions, that's kind of the mind aspect of this, where the passions will lead you in a certain direction. You'll get very passionate about something, and that's not about survival. That's not about striving to come above. It's not about that. It's a higher level than just eat, sleep, breed. All of the base sort of levels that kind of control and warp our society in their own way. And you can indeed, if you look around, you can see people who are kind of like slaves to this very base level of existence, and things kind of ascend in that way. That's how Aristotle saw it. He saw it as being, you must strive to overcome. You must strive to overcome these base desires, these base passions, all of these other things, and be rational all the time, or rather actually to hold these things in a balance. And so we kind of come full circle thousands of years later here in Jung. Okay, so, that's the mind, but where is the shadow? Well, the shadow is cast by the persona, so we'll define that. A persona is the mask with which our ego, it's what the ego presents to the world. It's what the ego has right out in front so that you see it. It's kind of a product of the ego while it's doing its balancing act. The persona is how the world sees you, and it can be somewhat controlled and somewhat uncontrolled. Kind of like an accent on speech. There are levels of control with which one can use to alter the results. If If I put my tongue in the front of my mouth and speak, it can take on a somewhat different sound, and if I keep it low, it may sound another way. How may we learn to speak with these sorts of manual adjustments? And these are unconscious. These are things that are kind of, it's all a part of when you are expressing yourself. For example, the default, Sassafras's default speak, default tongue. I don't know quite how to phrase it. I was born in Connecticut, and so in a lot of ways I have kind of, I guess, it's not, rather, it's not too far away from Boston, as it were. It's not too far from Boston. That's, there are different ways of speaking in different locations. In Connecticut, they have, I've seen it described as like, this is the journalist, this is the newscaster voice, where there's really no accent. There's really nothing present there. And then you have more regional dialects, or you have, influences of the South, different forms of like British language. I mean, it's crazy. Like even just in English, and of course, it's oversimplified by that because to the English-speaking West, the only language is English, and yet there are so many different dialects and so many different things. Linguistics is a field that I don't really have enough knowledge on, but I would love to learn more about linguistics and stuff like that. Well, regardless, to try and drag it back to shadow work. Well, it runs in the background. The persona is being projected outward, but it is kind of running in the background. Well, what can you impress upon people by what you are showing, by what you're projecting? Well, it only occasionally comes into view, these other things, and usually that part that isn't part of what you project, that isn't part of how you're speaking or where you're presenting on that, where does that kind of come out? If you've noticed when someone is kind of knocked off guard, if they have an accent that they don't normally use, and you occasionally hear a twang, ooh, when I was young, very, very young, just learning the language, I had difficulties in pronouncing R's after certain sounds, so I kind of had like the baby speech, like it wasn't butter, it was buttle. You know what I mean? Speech therapy eventually kind of solved that, but occasionally, if something really, really flusters me, occasionally you might hear a hint of, going back to that. That's what the shadow is for your personality itself. It's not something... It's something that it comes into view without your own personal effort. It's something that kind of gets knocked loose, and then very quickly you adjust that mask and no one sees what's behind it. And so indeed, that's kind of my take on shadow work. It's not something that one begins. It's instead something that you find yourself already waist deep in. It's not something that you consciously embark upon. It's something that you encounter on the road. The shadow itself is something you aren't consciously aware of. Instead, it's drawn out, and sometimes it has to be proven to you. If you suddenly say something and someone challenges you on that, and they're like, hey, isn't that a bit racist? And you're like, what? No, absolutely not. And then you think. And then you go home and you think about that, and you're like, ooh, wait. Because it may or may not be a conscious denial. It isn't always a negative thing. There are times in which what you have repressed and driven down deep into your soul is actually a helpful quality, just not one that you often wear. A very mousy person, and by that I mean someone who is meek and unassuming, not extroverted, well, they may actually, doesn't speak up. If someone says something that they disagree with, they just don't engage. They hold back. But within, they may well be passionate and articulate. But you'll never know. Damned if you'll know. It's like a singing voice. Some people can really belt that out, and some people can really hit that high note, but you'd never know. You can learn a lot about a person by hearing them sing. So I recently watched a film about a few men actually, who... Well, this guy's various addictions had left him a shadow of his former self. But like really, it's the circumstances are almost entirely brought on by himself. It's his own failures to control his impulses. I don't mean that in a nasty or a critical outsider perspective. It's like, look at this failure. No, no, no. I identify with this guy. um, the movie is it's funny. It's the resurrection of Jake the Snake Roberts. It's about a pro wrestler who at one point had a high flying and great career and then kind of vanishes from the public eye. And the film kind of the film doesn't chronicle his fall from grace. It's not that kind of story. It is not about how he fell. It's about how he fell and how that impacts him now. It's not about his fall. It's about his personality traits that caused him to fall and how they're still working against him, and him kind of coming to grips with help. There is no dishonor in getting help, and sometimes that's what people need. I mean, it's a rough film. It's a good film. You see the angels in his life, really. I think that while it is a rough film, and it's worth watching even if you don't have an interest in professional wrestling or its history, or this particular guy. It's just kind of one of those things. I mean, it's not. It's a documentary. It's filmed as a documentary. It doesn't have a plot line. It's not really all that polished. But you know what? I think that's a bit of a charm for it. But that being said, I found this to be a rough film to watch. I think self-sabotage is perhaps the best expression of when you need shadow work, of when you find yourself falling into a pattern. Later, we'll see. Trust me, eventually I'm going to address what you should try and do about it or what steps you can take. It's not like a 12-step program, although frankly, that particular, the 12-step program I'm referencing is a good and useful one for this purpose. In any case, it's a recognition of just how much you yourself clip your own wings, hold yourself back, hold yourself down from what you want to be or what you want to achieve. And things get really dark when one considers trauma, abuse, neglect, all of that dark shit, which makes you force your pain deeper and deeper and deeper, because no one wants to wear that for people to see. And so down it goes, down into the murk, into the silt at the bottom of the river of the soul, as it were. And then if something dredges it up, it's really not pretty. And this is meant to be more about aspects of your personality. Like I said before, it's not about the events which placed you where you may be, or the trauma, abuse, or neglect. I'm not talking about events. I'm talking about things that persevere past that, where instead you're scarred by those events. And indeed, they've molded you as a person. And how often do they mold you in a way that you don't necessarily feel served by? That's what I'm kind of getting at, is can you find these bits of yourself and kind of not necessarily isolate them? Because remember, the goal here is ultimately these are part of you. They're not going to go away. Sometimes tragedy doesn't make us better people. Instead, we will always feel to be a statue in the acid rain. And we know that there was beauty there once, but there it is. Here's where it stands. Here's how it is now. It's about when the wound defines you, perhaps, more than the rest of you. That's what I mean when I talk about dealing with trauma. It's about the internalized aspects, the things above and beyond events. And that's rough, because who fixes you? I mean, hell, who can even understand you to fix you? Help is good and useful, but it all starts with you. You must do what needs done. Sometimes that means seeking help. Sometimes it means being brave, taking a long look in the mirror and reevaluating just who you are to yourself and who you are to others. Sometimes it means keeping your patience or holding your tongue or putting down that liquor bottle. Everything in life worth doing is difficult. And the real victory isn't in the vanquishing of the great foe, the beheading of the dragon, the banishing of those foul demons. No. It's reconciliation. It's negotiating with yourself, finding a plan to set your life straight, which may well be then taking action on that plan and then keeping it up. it isn't just about making peace with those you've wronged, it's about making peace with yourself. And there's the rub. It's a lot easier sometimes to forgive someone else other than yourself than it is to forgive yourself. And well, sometimes forgiving someone else is impossible. So if forgiving someone else might be easier, how much harder is it to forgive yourself? But you're stuck with yourself. So what can you do but try? And after all, we have to accept the situation even if it doesn't turn out as we would wish. One will wrestle with one's vices for your entire life, and much of this is just about the struggle to be better. It's about striving towards that higher self and ending self-destructive cycles. And this is internal. I don't believe that one can truly receive validation for one's shadow work or have it properly recognized, because indeed it's a process, and that process doesn't end. I think you're asking too much of yourself and too much of someone else if first you're asking for validation and second you're seeking that validation from someone other than you. I do think that one can see sometimes when other people have done shadow work, maybe it shows in some ways. It's one of those things I'd have to... It's one of those intangibles where you feel somebody out. And listen, guys, it's possible that I don't understand this topic in a way which matters for anyone other than myself, that I haven't touched on an aspect of it which would matter to you personally. I have to acknowledge that as a possibility. Perhaps it's even a probability. I'm not meaning to dismiss anyone's struggles. If anything, I'm trying to acknowledge them. I'm trying to say that, you have to wrestle with these things, and perhaps you have to choose your battles and choose your battlefields for that. Like I said, it's something you find yourself in the middle of. It's not a thing you embark on. The greatest adventure is yourself, but you're already on it. So, breathe. It's not a thing that you have to prepare for. You're already going to be in the middle of it. Just deal with things as best you can. And that's really all anybody can ask from you. Regardless. So, about doing the shadow work, about that part of yourself, what can one do about it? Particularly since the goal isn't to expunge it, isn't to pull it out like a splinter, especially since one can't pull it out like a splinter. That's not how it is. Well, when you're on this, you should look around at yourself, your actions, the people you speak with, etc. See what gets to you and what sets you off, what launches you into a potent reaction. This is where kind of the logic is out of the way and you just find yourself in the middle of it. What gets you hot, find those parts of yourself which show suddenly and instinctively, and perhaps jealously, perhaps viciously. Perhaps you have a knee-jerk reaction to a particular thing which reveals an element of, say, racism or classism or ageism or something like that. What causes you to dismiss someone else's pain and say that's not such a big deal? Whatever, get over it. Perhaps you do that to yourself. These are naturally things that one wouldn't want to wear on one's sleeve. You wouldn't want to come up front and be like, yeah, people who are dealing with this particular situation, well, that's nothing compared to me. I've been through way worse. They need to just toughen up, etc., etc. Everybody's on their own journey. A person can be harmed by something when they themselves are the perpetrator. There's a lot of depth to all of this stuff, and that's one of the things you get to wrestle with. But it's about identifying things in your life that don't necessarily serve you, or that are self-destructive. You have to, and here's the tough thing, you have to explore those feelings, those impulses. You've got to feel them out and see what it would have of you, what your inner demons are about, and why. Most importantly, why. And I compare it to charting the abyss. And you don't do so from a perspective of conquering it. It's not about that. It's instead about delving down deep and running your hands through that dark river mud and clouding the water for a bit and knowing that you're the water, that you're the mud and the silt, and you're the air above the surface of the water as well. You are a complete picture. You are a good and worthy and worthwhile person. And good and worthy and worthwhile people will wrestle with their demons. They will try and recognize their actions and the effects that those actions have on people. And I know that this podcast has sounded completely mundane, perhaps. It sounds entirely like I'm just talking about psychology. But in reality, a good bit of this is spiritual alchemy. This is how one turns lead into gold. This is how one can find spiritual growth, can overcome spiritual boundaries, and indeed better understand the forces and energies of the cosmos. And you are a part of that cosmos. A quote from Leonardo da Vinci here is that you will never have a greater or lesser dominion than that over yourself. The height of a man's success is gauged by his self-mastery, the depth of his failure by his self-abandonment. And this law is the expression of eternal justice. He who cannot establish dominion over himself will have no dominion over others. And I think in a few ways it is kind of that sort of quest to master yourself, and that includes the ugly parts too. And if you think that, I mean, it's one of those things where one of the best pieces of advice I was ever given on witchcraft and on the occult is to ever and always read things esoterically. And that means to look beneath the initial surface and look for connections, to look for depth, to kind of plumb it and search it out for a deeper value than is there on the surface. I think that this psychological exercise, and indeed this working on your own personality, and it is working on your personality because you're attempting to recognize things that previously you couldn't, and that's why it's in a shadow, because you don't necessarily see it, at least not obviously. It's not what you want to show off. I think that if you would say that there's no spiritual or religious value in that, I think you might be a little bit naive there. This is not about psychology at all. This is about the whole picture. And spirituality is a part of that whole picture. Absolutely. In any case, since we're here at the end of this, I see I've almost reached my time, or rather the time that I've set for this. I would like to thank a number of folks who have encouraged me to continue to do this. I'd like to thank, of course, I'd love to thank my coven, who have never stopped supporting me and telling me that I need to keep doing this, and no, just get something down. That's fine. I'd like to thank my wife, who has also been very, very supportive. I'd like to thank a bunch of folks who have told me and encouraged me to keep at this. I hope everyone is fine. Things are, let's see, it's the tail end of January. It's been a crazy year this past year. It's been a crazy beginning of this year. I hope everyone is safe. I want everyone to take care of themselves as best as can, and to be kind to yourself if you can. I have kind of given up on my Twitter page. I mean, as you can, the last time I posted was at the beginning of October. So if you've hung with me this long, I do plan on posting more things in the future. And I can be reached at heartofwitchcraft@gmail.com. I do have a Twitter handle, which is heartwitchcraft, but I don't keep up on it like I should. Perhaps that'll change in the future. I'll let you know. But I can be reached via those two mediums. If you'd like to tell me something, a number of you have, and I appreciate your encouragement as well. But life is complicated and sometimes gets in the way. But that is what it is too. Anyway, take care, friends, and I'll speak with you soon.